but they're not gods, they are human beings. And so the first thing I try and do is to kind of dethrone them, is to demystify them, to push away this patina of mythologization, which you find surrounds so many of them. So I have stories and anecdotes about people like Himmler or Goebbels and so on, which try and point out that they are actual human beings.
Hello. Adolf Hitler is often described as a monster, but that lets him off the hook. He was a human being like us, and in today's episode I speak with Richard Evans, historian of Nazi Germany and the author of a new book, Hitler's People. We discuss Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels and Heydrich, as well as the film Denial, which dramatises a trial that Richard took part in, when historian Davig Irving sued Penguin Random House and Deborah Lipstadt of libeling him as a Holocaust denier. Plenty more great history to come, including Alice Loxton talking historical figures at 18 years old. And then we have an Operation Market Gardens special, since it's the 80th anniversary of A Bridge Too Far. Thank you for those who have given a kind rating on Apple and Spotify. For those that haven't done it yet, please do, it really helps. But until then, I'm going to hand you over to me, talking Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels and Heydrich, with Richard Evans. Richard, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're here to talk about your new book, your latest book, Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. And I've been reading it. It's wonderful. First thing I'd say, it's wonderful to have a book where you've got the biographies of all the key figures of Nazi Germany in one volume. You know, and obviously written in your very distinctive and exhaustive way. I feel like, you know, I'm kind of well armed if I want to speak to anyone about Hitler's Germany, and because so much has been written about Nazi Germany. I assume your aim was simply to have a sort of, I guess, an extended version of Who's Who.
No, it's not. It's not a biographical dictionary. It's a book which has a message, as it were, but beyond these couple of dozen chapters. And that is that what we're dealing with here, when you look at Nazi perpetrators, as we call them, from Hitler downwards through Goebbels, Goering, then Heydrich, Eichmann, and then right down to the lowest level of what you might call ordinary mass murderers, is we're dealing with human beings. And so much of the literature is based, it kind of, in a weird way, glorifies or perhaps demonizes is a better word. So a lot of there's a phrase, a German word that's often used with about the last few months of Nazi Germany, which is Goethe der Ordnung, and that means twilight of the gods. And for goodness sake, these are not gods, you know. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, talked in a different context also altogether of Götzendämmerung, which is much better phrase, much better word. It's a twilight of the idols, but they're not gods, they are human beings. And so the first thing I try and do is to kind of dethrone them, is to demystify them, to push away this this kind of patina of mythologization which you find surrounds so many of them. So I have stories and anecdotes about people like Himmler or Goebbels and so on, which try and point out that they are actual human beings. So otherwise, if we demonize them, we're saying, well, they're not like us. This is not really a human problem. It comes from outside. It's kind of beyond history. It's beyond society. And that's much too easy. It's a form of kind of exculpation for the rest of us.
Yes. So by humanizing them, then it almost acts as a kind of a warning.
Exactly. Yeah. That's another thing. I mean, I wanted to, you know, we're living in an age where democracy is under threat all over the world, and strong men and would-be or even real dictators are emerging all over the place and all the time. And this is a warning from history in a way.
Indeed. Well, so I thought that we could talk about, you know, the figures, and starting, of course, with Adolf Hitler. And yeah. I was very interested in reading the section which takes, it's the longest part of the book. as you explain early on, that it should be, really. And during his rise, it's interesting to learn how his anti-Semitism develops. His childhood isn't, there's little anti-Semitism beyond the norm that I guess existed, that was quite widespread in Europe at the time. But it develops particularly post First World War. And that's actually something that you notice with a number of the other figures. They don't seem to have this sort of innate the paranoid anti-Semitism, I think you describe it as. It's with Hitler, it develops, but then he becomes the strongest proponent of it. Is that really him searching for some kind of reason for his lack of success in life?
Not
Early
really, no,
life.
I don't think so. I mean, anti-Semitism was absolutely central and core to the Nazi Party, to the Nazi project, to the Third Reich. And it struck me very forcibly, yet again, how powerful an influence and an objective the hatred of Jews was. And that's Jews defined racially and not by their religion. And of course, Nazis, particularly Hitler, in his autobiographical political tract, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, or My Fight, written in the middle of the 1920s, he tries to kind of suggest that he always was an anti-Semite. But there'd been some very interesting work done a few years ago now by a historian called Brigitte Hamann, which shows that in his life before 1914, he was no more than averagely anti-Semitic, trivially anti-Semitic, if at all. He had good friends who were Jewish. He didn't involve himself in politics. And as with some of the other leading Nazis and further down the scale with ordinary Nazis, it was the trauma of the loss of World War One, which really turned him into a visceral, conspiratorial, paranoid anti-Semite. He believed from that moment on, from the end of the war, when Germany was shockingly and surprisingly comprehensively defeated, that he sought an explanation in the belief, in the paranoid conspiracy theory that Jews were behind it all, that they had stabbed Germany in the back, as the phrase went, like Siegfried in Wagner's music drama, The Ring of the Nibelung. He thought, well, Jews are on the home front. Jews dominate the socialist and communist parties. The army was undefeated. They stabbed it in the back from the home front by fomenting revolution. Now, this is kind of completely ridiculous. Jews were a tiny, tiny minority in German society, less than 1%. Is extraordinary. There were some Jews, of course, in the socialist and communist movements, but by definition, they'd given up on their Jewish identity and assumed a revolutionary working class identity. And they did not have the kind of power and influence that Hitler supposed. But for him, it was a kind of convenient conspiracy theory. And we see again now today, conspiracy theories re-emerging about politics, particularly the QAnon conspiracy theory, where again, absurdly, world elites are being accused by the conspiracy theorists of being pedophiles and managing the kind of what people like Alex Jones, conspiracy theorists, call a new world order, and so on. So this kind of theorizing has a lot of power, and it really was behind the rise of the Nazi Party. It's what the Nazis believed.
It's interesting you talk about today, because you really do see it. Even with commentators, you can see some commentators, it sort of acts, you can see they almost are repeating these tropes without realizing it.
That's right, absolutely, yes. And it's a belief in a global conspiracy and a mindset. And you can see that emerging in all sorts of surprising ways. So that's one of the things that motivated me to write this book, really, to see if we can learn from the study of the leading Nazis and then the Nazi followers and all the way down the scale of perpetrators. What made these people tick? What made them follow Hitler? What made Hitler take the lead? So there's that kind of why question behind them all, and that really is why it's not a biographical dictionary. These are biographical chapters linked by a set of common questions.
Well, one of the reasons why many of his followers were so devoted to him was because of his speeches and the way he could deliver these speeches. And you write about how emphatic he is in these speeches, very clear. And of course, then there's that sort of, in inverted commas, charisma that really does inspire his followers. But I was interesting as I was reading the Hitler chapter, and then towards the end of his, as war is declared, he makes these increasingly deranged speeches, and the contrast between the two, as in his early days. If you were a follower and a devotee of Hitler, by then you're all in. It's too late. You're with him, and so you wouldn't really notice the frankly weird nature of his speeches, or is there something else there?
Well, in this period, in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, of course, there isn't any television. It's only just been invented. Not many Germans have radios, surprisingly enough. The weekly news around the cinema is the only way you get the news, and you see people, and that's edited post facto and so on. So for politics, big speeches in the open air or in huge meeting halls, that's the way you get support. And Hitler, during the election campaigns, the free elections of the early 30s, 31, 32, he actually flies around in a plane, and he can, deliver half a dozen speeches in different places in a day. Interestingly, when Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister, went to try and negotiate a deal with Hitler in Munich in 1938, it's the first time he'd ever flown. So, this is very advanced propaganda for the time. And initially, Hitler, of course, just spoke in the open air, but later on, he had microphones, he had relays, all of that kind of thing. And these are increasingly staged, and of course, particularly when he gets the resources of the state behind him in 1933. So he always starts in the same kind of way in one of his big speeches. And they are prepared. He has a few notes, but he speaks freely from them, so making it appear as if he's sort of spontaneous from the heart. And he's always late arriving. There's a lot of, bands and music and razzmatazz and banners and so on. And then he arrives and he starts very slowly and very quietly. So you have to kind of listen, and then when he got the audience, he then starts building it all up and reaches a kind of frenzy later on. And he wasn't, in many ways, a political realist. He believed in his mission at a time, and in 1928, the Nazi Party was an absolute fringe party. He's less than 3% of the national vote. And what catapulted him into office was the Wall Street crash in 1929, and then the withdrawal of American loans that have underpinned the German economy, and mass unemployment, 35% officially, probably much more than that by 1930, 32. And people, for many voters, this is the last straw. And the Weimar Republic, so-called, the democracy, was blamed then by a good number of Germans for the humiliation of Germany in the peace settlement at the end of World War I, the economic disaster of a hyperinflation in the early 20s, and then of the depression in the early 1930s. And for many middle-class people, it was the fear of communism. The only political party, including the Nazis, that constantly increased its vote while there were free elections were the Communist Party. The Nazis lost a bit at the end of the 1920s. So it's, his public speaking is the foundation of his appeal. It only reached just over a third of the German electorate. If you put together the communist and socialist parties, they got more votes than the Nazis in the elections of November 1932, but they were at daggers drawn with each other. They couldn't combine to stop the Nazis. And then, of course, during the 1930s, these are stage managed, backed by the whole power of a monopoly party, of a single party state. During the war, however, when things are going to go wrong for the Nazis, for the German government from 1932 onwards, bombing raids, failure on the Eastern Front against Soviet Russia, then he speaks less and less, and begins to kind of withdraw from the public in some ways, despite his propaganda minister Goebbels telling him, "You've got to do this." And you've got Churchill and King George VI and the Queen visiting bomb sites in London during the Blitz. Hitler didn't want to know about it. He did not know that Germany was being bombed.
That really does expose him for who he is, really.
Yeah.
Well, of course, he had written Mein Kampf, and you mentioned Mein Kampf, of course, but he's written that. And I was interested to read in some of the historiography writing about Mein Kampf, there are some who've written that really not that many Germans read the book. But that's not true, is it?
No, I think, there's a lot of myths have been put about concerning Hitler and the Nazis. And he actually did write it. He didn't dictate it to a secretary while he was in rather comfortable prison confinement after the failure of the beer hall putsch in 1923. And of course, people edited it. They corrected the not always very good German, and they cut it down and tried to sort of organize it. And it is a really boring book, I'm afraid. There's only a few bits where he talks about propaganda in particular, which are interesting. But of course, when he came to power in 1933, everyone had a copy. You got a free copy if you got married, and all kinds of ways in which it was. But even before then, people wanted to know about him. He'd risen from obscurity to prominence in a couple of years at the end of the 20s. They bought the book just to see what was going on. And it's not a blueprint. It's not a blueprint for power, but you can extract some core ideas: anti-Semitism, belief in getting what he calls living space in Eastern Europe. It's a conquest of Eastern Europe, and to provide food and supplies for the German economy, and a number of things like that. That's one of the many ways in which historians have been helped over the last quarter of a century by the appearance of new sources and newly discovered documents. And in this case, it's a scholarly edition in 2 enormous volumes by the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, which came out just recently, just a few years ago, and thoroughly annotated. So every one of his lies and distortions is pinpointed in the margins, etc.
Oh, that sounds fantastic, actually. I was really interested reading about the street violence, which is such an important element for the Nazi Party. And of course, begins early on. And obviously, Hitler is always he's encouraging it. But I was interested how that filters down to actually, on the streets itself. Was it something that Hitler would, issue orders to his subordinates and then it would filter down, or was it direct from speech? Then the men on the ground would hear it and then would carry it out?
Well, in the 1920s, you're living in a post-war situation. If you see any newsreels at the time, the streets in Germany are full of uniformed people, of discharged soldiers. Every political party has its paramilitary uniformed armed branch. Street violence is really common, from the Red Front Fighters League of the Communists right across to the Nazis on the far right. When Hitler took over as leader of the Nazi Party in 1920-21, he injects a whole new level of violence into it. So they attacked their opponents, they broke up their meetings, they had street battles and street fights, they worked their way through pubs and bars in the big cities, driving out socialists and communists. So in the election campaign of June, July 1932, there's over 400 deaths in Germany. I was in extraordinary levels of violence. And the brown shirts, Nazi stormtroopers, are by 1933, they're 2 million strong. I mean, it's absolutely massive. Hitler gave occasional remarks and speeches where he said, well, we've got to be cautious and careful, and violence is not great, but we will smash our opponents, of course. So he kind of wants to have it both ways. And there were many prosecutions from the jurists and prosecutors of the Weimar Republic in 1932-33, which were all quashed by Hitler when he came came to power. So, it's often said that after failure of a direct assault on the citadels of power in the so-called beer hall putsch of 1923, which storms onto the middle in an armed group in the middle of Munich and is shot down by a hail of bullets and is arrested and put in trial. That it's often said that then convinced him that the peaceful road to power was the only one that you had to go for electoral success. But that's only half the picture. It's a twin track approach, so that the Nazis also, along with propaganda and electoral campaigning, they also carried on and built up and intensified the battle against their enemies on the streets.
Well, he had this frustration from the First World War, and as you say, this the stab in the back myth. But Hitler's relationship with the army, and then Hitler as general, he sort of takes all the credit for the early successes of the of the various invasions. And so I was interested in how it was a sort of transactional relationship between the Wehrmacht and Hitler. Is that right? Because they received success as a result of his aggressive approach.
Yeah, well, the German army is limited to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, by the settlement at the end of World War One, and so it was an army with a lot of generals and not many men, as it were. It was all chiefs and no Indians, and these were left over from the Imperial Germany, and these were men who bitterly resented the defeat that they'd had to endure in 1918, and they were all gagging for a new war, another European war, which would be a successful one. And Hitler told them that's what he would deliver. That's what he told them that he would do. He'd have another European war. And of course, many conventional statesmen in other countries, like Neville Chamberlain or Stanley Baldwin, did not recognize that he was not going to play by the rules. They thought he was going to simply take over German-speaking parts of Europe, like Austria, or the borderlands, the so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and leave it at that. But he was from the start hell-bent on a war and on the conquest of the whole of Europe. So, there's a lot of misperceptions of him. The army went along with that. They were anti-Semitic, but they didn't want a holocaust, I don't think. Had they staged a military coup, which was certainly possible in 1932 and the beginning of 1933, then I think there would have been another war, but it wouldn't be in the same kind of racial exterminatory war. Although when it came to it, in the 1940s, the army participated willingly and extensively with the Holocaust.
Well, there are elements of the army that actually do decide to bump him off, and we've recently had the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the July plot. But I always am interested in, had Hitler been assassinated at any point during the many attempts on his life? I think it varies. I think there are around about 15. No, not that many?
Yeah, in fact, I just recorded a series of 3 TV programs about assassination plots where Netflix, who commissioned it, thought there were dozens of them, but there's hardly any. It's quite surprising, and it's quite interesting to look at it. There's a lone socialist called Georg Elser, who's a carpenter.
Oh, yes.
Who really succeeds in blowing Hitler up in 1939. And there's only one other really serious one, which is the army-led plot in July 1944, which ends in Colonel Stauffenberg trying to blow up Hitler on the 20th of July, but he fails to do that. But otherwise, it's really not very common. It was very difficult to get near him. Socialists and communists were suppressed, and nearly 200,000 of them were arrested and put in camps in 1933 and only released on promise of not involving themselves in politics. There's a whole huge system of surveillance and control led by so-called block wardens. Every housing block in every German town and city had a Nazi agent there who was meant to enforce conformity. Gestapo were very efficient and very effective, so it's quite difficult. And you have these mostly middle-ranking officers who were when Germany was clearly losing the war, thought they could negotiate a separate peace, and were also, to give them their due, increasingly outraged by the Holocaust, the extermination of 6 million European Jews in progress from 1942 onwards. And so they launched a series of attempts to kill Hitler, which in the end came to nothing.
Well, had they been successful, and I guess it depends at various points during Hitler, when Hitler was in power. But if we pick sort of 39 or 44, I understand the hierarchy of the regime, but that wouldn't necessarily dictate who would replace Hitler, because presumably there'd be internal
I did
struggles.
actually write. A few years ago, I wrote a whole book saying what if questions were meaningless and pointless, because you can't control for all the variables, and counterfactual history, as it's called, rests on altering one variable and leaving all the others the same. But that's not how it works, So you can't really say. There were various contenders to succeed Hitler. My guess is that had he actually been blown up and killed by Stauffenberg, there would have been some kind of civil war, probably would have broken out, because the plotters had the support of some senior generals, but not most of them. The SS were becoming, led by Heinrich Himmler, increasingly powerful. They certainly would have resisted, and it's very difficult to know what would have happened. And beneath all this, of course, there's the Allied decision in beginning of 1943 that they'll go for unconditional surrender. So the idea that the plotters had was that they would be able to negotiate a peace is completely unrealistic. But then, harking back to what you were saying earlier a bit, Hitler his relationship with reality is only kind of rather indirect, and during the war, he became increasingly detached from reality. If you look at his speeches, the decreasing number he gave during the war, the hyperbole is the center of them, massive exaggeration. It's the greatest victory in history, it's the most dastardly plot ever launched, and so on. It does, in fact, though I'm wary about parallels, remind one of Donald Trump and the kind of narcissistic exaggerations he engaged in.
It is a problem because everyone's accused of being Adolf Hitler,
That's right.
just randomly hurled around.
But though, history never repeats itself. But as Mark Twain is supposed to have said, sometimes it rhymes.
Yes, absolutely. Well, okay, I'm glad you mentioned Heinrich Himmler. And you open the chapter with a hilarious story of him in a sauna, embarrassing himself, basically.
That's right. Yes, there's a wonderful set of memoirs by a disillusioned Italian fascist journalist called Zio Malaparte, and he calls it Caput. And it's very funny, and some of the stories are seem rather sort of imaginative. But he's sent to cover a Nazi delegation visiting Finland, and he gets, as happens when you go to Finland, he gets invited to a sauna, which you don't want, it's not wise to refuse, so the Finns get very offended. So he goes into this sauna, and who's there but stark naked, but Himmler, and the general who's taking Malaparte and gives Himmler a Nazi salute. So and Himmler jumps up. Malaparte says he's so sweating so profusely he thinks any longer he would have been a little puddle on the floor. And so Himmler gives a Nazi salute, and the people around him take that as a signal to get out the next stage of the traditional Finnish sauna, which is with birch twigs, and start whipping him. And he sort of rushes out and dives into the frozen river, and it's very embarrassing. And Malaparte said, he looks completely defensive. And I tell that story partly to, again, demythologize him. He is a kind of human being. It's typical of the way in which the Nazis have been kind of mythologized, and in his case, as with many other leading Nazis, he's described as petty bourgeois or as socially marginal. There's an idea you find quite widespread that they're gangsters. It's a wonderful movie by Hollywood movie made to show American soldiers what they're going to fight about. It's a movie made called The Hitler Gang, and it's in the style of a 1930s Hollywood gangster movie. It's very entertaining and not very accurate, but they chose not famous actors, but lookalikes of Goebbels and Himmler and so on. Himmler's kind of disqualified was pretty bourgeois. But if you look at all of these people, as I've done, you find that they're from the center of German society. They're from the educated middle class. Himmler's father was held down a very prestigious job, which is a high school professor, as they called them. And he was also tutor to a member of the Bavarian royal family that were very well connected. And like a lot of other people in the Nazi hierarchy, he suffered a kind of traumatic loss of status, not just with the in personal terms, but with the end of World War One and the overthrow of the Bavarian and all the other German monarchies. So the family kind of lost their status and lost their job. He's sometimes described as a chicken breeder, but he wasn't at all. He tried a little bit of farming when he was on his BMNs in the early to mid-20s, but that didn't really work. It wasn't his profession at all. So Himmler became a politician quite early on, and he managed to get a position as the head of Hitler's personal bodyguard, the SS, which then mushroomed and became a much larger organization. And in the end, during the war, started to kind of swallow up the rest of Nazi Germany.
It was interesting reading about his micromanagement. And you mentioned Jörg Elser. I had read in another account of attempts on Hitler's life that Himmler actually visited Elsa in his cell during the torturing to give him a kicking himself. Which is a level of micromanagement that you also write about in the book. It surprised me, actually.
Yeah, we know a lot more about Himmler than we used to. So with the sauna story, for example, we can verify that because his appointments diary turned up a couple of decades ago in a Russian archive, and there it is on the day in question, sauna. A second volume of that appointments diary turned up even more recently, about half a dozen years ago. And we've got his correspondence. So, his letters have been collected and letters to SS officers. And the micromanagement, you say, is absolutely extraordinary. He tells them what to do all the time. He tells them who to marry and what to eat. And there's a hilarious directive he issues about porridge. Porridge, you've got to make it with water and not with milk, and just all of that kind of thing. We also have this, power often brings out kind of hidden side of people. It allows people to fulfill their fantasies. And so Himmler, from quite early on, was a devotee of pseudo-historical views and visions of Germanic religion. So he set up in the SS a kind of non-Christian pseudo-Germanic forms of ritual, including marriage, for example. He wanted the SS not to refer to the Christian months, but to what he regarded as pagan Germanic names, like Yule instead of December, Christmas, and so on.
I wanted to talk about Joseph Goebbels briefly. He is often derided as a sort of farcical figure, a figure of fun, not only by us today, but also by his contemporaries. But do you think there's something we're missing with him? Because could he have potentially have replaced Hitler at some stage? Was he at that level where he was more than just this sort of farcical individual?
Yeah, it's impossible to answer, but I think it's unlikely. It's he didn't have an independent power base. He was completely bound to Hitler and Hitler's own personality. But we know more than we ever did about him. The last of 32 volumes of his diaries came out in 2008 in German. And he was like Samuel Pepys. He's one of these compulsive diarists who can't finish a day or begin the next one without actually writing a diary entry. And of course, you have to be critical about them. They don't always tell the truth, but they're actually surprisingly honest in most ways. He was the chief propagandist of the Nazi Party and then of the regime, and he organized public life and the media in particular. It's an illustration of a basic fact about dictatorships, that they have to control the media, they have to suppress alternative ways of portraying what's going on. And of course, in Nazi Germany, you didn't have police, didn't have an independent press. You just had whatever Goebbels' propaganda machine was pumping out in terms of newspapers, newsreels, radio broadcasts, and all the rest of it. And he was a very clever propagandist. He realized people don't want to listen to continual diet of political stuff. Actually, in our country, the UK, that's been bad enough during the election campaign. But so he, he'd get bored quite quickly. So he had all kinds of ideas for alternative, more or less non-political media events. He had a request concert on the radio, and films. Of course, he banned direct films after Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, a propaganda film about the 1934 Party Congress. He didn't ban any more films of that kind. There weren't any more. One was enough. It was an absolutely brilliant piece of propaganda. So if you're going to do it, you have to do it indirectly through, through cinema dramas of one sort and another, which he did use. Goebbels was not. I mean, he was again. He was one of the very few leading Nazis who came from a lower middle class background, but he made good for that. Went to university. He couldn't fight in the war because he had a club foot or deformity of the foot, and was slightly disabled in that way. But so he went to university, he got a PhD, and ever after he was always referred to as Dr. Goebbels. It's a very important title in German culture, and still is actually. So Goebbels was not. I think he's not respected, and not personally. But I think he is obviously an enormously powerful figure in terms of the propaganda and the media, and a man of a lot of resource and a lot of presence of mind. A very intelligent man, I think.
We see that dedication to Hitler within hours of Hitler's death. Goebbels is following.
At the end, yes, he his wife and their 6 children, all of whose names began with H in honor of Hitler himself, went into the bunker underneath the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler was and his entourage are now hiding in 1940-45 from Allied bombing raids and the encroaching Russian forces, the encroaching Red Army. And after Hitler's killed himself, Goebbels and his wife say quite explicitly they don't think his life will be worth living without Hitler and after the end of the Reich. So they poisoned their 6 children and killed themselves. It's a very squalid end to their lives.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Well, if we look at the Holocaust, because you have a number of individuals here who were the architects of it, obviously Himmler, and then Heydrich and Eichmann. But I wanted to ask you briefly, you've, of course, were involved in the libel trial with Deborah Lipstadt and Davig Irving. And I was always, and of course, there's the Hollywood movie, which I assume you're delighted with, Denial.
Yes. So I'd say the man who played me, the now late John Sessions, I do feel he should have lost weight before he went in front of the cameras. But then I can consoled by the fact that the leading characters the actors bear no relation physically to the people they're portraying. So Timothy Spall portrays Irving as a sort of weaselly little man, or a very large, dominating, loud figure, and so on. But yes, no, Denial, which came out several years ago now, in 2015 or 2016, is a pretty accurate, pretty. It follows the letter and the spirit of the action, in which I was an expert witness charged with going through Davig Irving's work with a view to reporting to the court on whether he falsified history and denied the Holocaust. And I found both of those were the case. And that incidentally, that made me then. The lawyers kept on asking, can you direct me to some background reading, a good large scale general history of Nazi Germany. So and I couldn't. This is like the year 2000 or 1999. So as is the way of such things with us historians, I decided to do one myself. And in fact, it was going back to, there's a TV series, two TV series I've been involved in very recently. One called Rise of the Nazis in 9 parts, in which I was involved in for BBC Two in particular, which focused on a biographical approach to the rise of the Nazis. And that got me going back to the whole Nazi phenomenon and realizing that it's a time, along with contemporary political developments, to approach the whole thing from a different perspective, in a biographical perspective. And the book's not just about the leading Nazis, though they occupy a large place in it. It's about different layers and different levels of complicity in the whole Holocaust and in the war. It's about all the way down to ordinary perpetrators and mass murderers and fellow travelers and followers. So I had to pick representative figures at that level, as well as doing the leading figures earlier on in the book.
I suppose with the Holocaust, the Nazis, I mean, they knew what they were doing. I think there's a quote from Goebbels: "What we're doing to the Jews is barbaric,
That's
but
right.
they deserve it."
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, one of the clues to understanding these people is that this is a regime that upends normal moral criteria, so that words like barbaric and ruthless become positive words instead of negative, as we would understand them and use them.
Well, if there is a smoking gun, okay, obviously there's the physical evidence, which is, it is the evidence. I've been to Auschwitz, so, it's clear to see. But we have the Wannsee conference, and I'm just surprised that Irving would dismiss something like the document that was found from one of the participants, a document like that, because you have Heydrich, who features in your book, and Eichmann as well, along with senior members of the civil service in the Nazi party and et cetera, all participating in, the final solution, as it's described as.
Yeah, I mean, I also have a chapter on it too, sort of very low-level perpetrators who shot thousands of Jews and so on. So at every level, there was an extraordinary moment in the Irving libel trial where Richard Rampton, alas, recently died, the defense QC, as they were then. He produced a document, and it's a report, and Irving agrees it's authentic, and so he has them read it out, and it's a report from an extermination center called Chelmno, where the man who writes, the SS man who writes it, says we've recently killed 90,000 Jews in gas vans, where the exhaust is fed back into the back of the van, and there are Jews who are asphyxiated. And so Irving accepts that, and then Rampton made him read out a bit of his own book where he said gassing was not used to kill Jews except on an experimental basis. And Rampton simply said, "Do you call 90,000 experimental, Mr. Irving?" He had to admit it. So there's the kind of proof of the Holocaust on many different levels, from contemporary documents, from the memoirs and recollections of survivors and of perpetrators, the extraordinary memoirs of the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, which are written when he was under sentence of death after the end of the war, which I think carried out. There's a whole huge mass of evidence. What's the difficulty, of course, is explaining why, but the factuality of it is not in dispute, except by conspiracy theorists who won't accept what your eyes could see.
When Irving was a younger historian, was he considered a talent when he was young, before he engaged in this sort of denial of the Holocaust?
I mean, David Irving was always he's quite elderly now. He was born in 1938. And apparently he's not very well, but he was always a right-wing extremist, I think. Even at school, he was an admirer of Hitler. There's an extraordinary moment later on at the end of the trial when he's giving his closing address to the court, and he's had a slip of the tongue and called the judge mein Führer, and everybody laughed, and I was phoned up by a psychiatrist, curiously, a few days later, who was working on Freudian slips. And he said, "Did you hear that?" I said, "Yes, I did. I couldn't believe my ears, But I said, "How do you explain it?" He said, "Well, born in 1938 and Hitler, sorry, now I'm having a slip of the tongue. Born in 1938, Hitler for Irving was a kind of benign father figure, but because Irving's father went away to the war and didn't come back, and his mother must have said, he's gone to fight for Mr. Churchill." And so for Irving, Hitler became this kind of benign authority figure. His brother called him during the war. He lived just to the east of London, and where German bombers are coming over, Irving rushed him out into the back garden to give a Nazi salute to them. And in the trial, the Judge Charles Gray, was very careful not to give Irving the opportunity to appeal on the grounds that he was a litigant in person. In other words, he was up against a very experienced barrister, Richard Rampton, but he consisted on conducting the trial himself and not having a barrister. So the judge is always complimenting him on his knowledge of the law, which I have to say is not terribly believable, but the judge is very concerned to get Irving as well on his side. And so in the excitement of the closing statement, Irving just confused the judge with Hitler's two benign authority figures. And I found that quite sort of plausible explanation, really.
Yes. Well, I wanted to finish our conversation because we're running out of time with Reinhard Heydrich, who
yes.
Always seems to me to be the sort of very image of a Nazi, the blonde, tall, but he again only engages, it seems, he joins the Nazi party fairly late because it's going to help his career. He's not necessarily...
Yeah. I mean, again, you were about to say blonde beast, and that's what he's not, of course. Again, it's a very good example of how these people came from the center of respectable German society. They all came from conservative families, nationalist families on the right, not a single ex-communist or ex-socialist among them, nobody from the working class. Heydrich came from a musical family, professional musicians, and he himself was a very professional, very proficient violinist, and said to be moved to tears when he played some music on his violin. And he and a number of other, the so-called butcher of Warsaw, the head of a Polish Nazi-occupied Poland, Hans Frank, was apparently a very good pianist, and so on. So Heydrich was an example in another way of he had a drastic fall in his social standing, like Hitler had, or a number of other Nazi leaders had, and the country as a whole, in the views of right-wing nationalists, had also slipped down the scale and suffered a trauma in the defeat of World War I. Heydrich was engaged to a young woman, and then had an affair with another one who he eventually married, and the spurned fiance's father was, unfortunately for Heydrich, a relatively high officer in the German Navy, to which Heydrich belonged. And he brought an action in a so-called court of honor against him, and Heydrich was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. It just destroyed his career, and he then joined the Nazis and became head of the Nazi security service. And in that capacity, he then had enormous power in Himmler's organization and became one of the key figures in carrying out the Holocaust. And it's striking when you read accounts of what Heydrich believed in, what he said. There's a kind of real cold fanaticism there that is difficult to find in a number of other leading Nazis. But and it's been argued by some German historians that this is a kind of generation, the first post-war generation of young nationalist right-wing Germans who think it's their job to finish off the war, fight it better and more ruthlessly and more completely than it was done by the generals and admirals who failed between 1914 and 1918. And it's Heydrich who calls this conference late 1941, and it actually happens in early 1942, in Wannsee, it's a suburb of Berlin, a rather charming villa on a lake. And That is, as it were, to have joined up genocide. It's to make sure that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. It's the Foreign Office, the SS, various bureaucratic instances, the occupation authorities in Poland, and so on, and that they all agree that the Jews will be exterminated. It's already underway, but not in that systematic, coordinated way that it was in 1942. So Heydrich is a very interesting figure. He's eventually assassinated by two Czech agents brought in from Britain to bump him off, which they do successfully.
I don't know if you saw the BBC HBO production starring Kenneth Branagh as Heydrich, called Conspiracy.
Yeah, I did. Yes, it was excellent. It's very clever because there are minutes of the Wannsee conference taken by Adolf Eichmann, another of these leading bureaucratic figures in the Holocaust. But they fill in the gaps by using other sources like the diaries of Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologue of the Nazi Party, for example, who also figures in my book. And it's very good. It's well worth watching.
I watched an interview with Kenneth Branagh, who had also described it as one of the most frightening experiences of his life, stepping into the shoes of Heydrich. But I think he said something else that did occur to me whilst reading your chapter on Heydrich, in that he said that if Heydrich was told that he had to exterminate tennis players, then he would do that.
No, I don't think so. No. And neither Heydrich nor Eichmann is a kind of man who's just following orders. No, that was a standard excuse of those Nazis who survived the war and were not absolutely at the top level. No, those anti-Semitism is central to the regime. It's been the message that the Jews are evil and wicked and must be exterminated, pumped out either directly or implicitly by Nazi media all the way through the 1930s and early 40s. Heydrich internalized this until he believed that the Jews had to be killed without exception. The Wannsee Conference minutes are extraordinary because there's a long list of how many Jews there are in each European country, including many countries where the Nazis had not succeeded in conquering or occupying. And this is going to go on and on. Himmler's trip to Finland was not just to enjoy the sauna, and he became actually really enthusiastic about saunas later on. It was also to try and ensure that Finland delivered its Jewish population, which is absolutely minute, only a few hundred, to him for taking to Auschwitz and being killed. There's a kind of thoroughness about it, which is quite extraordinarily obsessive.
Yes, one imagines that had they been successful in the Second World War, they would have marched on the British mandate to sort of continue the extermination beyond Europe.
Yes. There's even hints in Hitler's so-called second book, which only came to light in the 1960s, which wasn't published for various reasons, of a sequel to Mein Kampf, that when he gets control of the whole of Europe, he's going to go after America. Yeah, I mean, Hitler, war without end and without limit was actually central to his vision of the future, because he believed a race like the Germans, or Aryans as he called them, could not survive really unless it was engaged in perpetual warfare, which would toughen it up.
Well, Richard, this has been absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much for your time.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great content to come, so please do follow or subscribe. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.